This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to
Hi.
Colloquium this week.
Good to see you, David.
I'm going to introduce
restful
Mr.
day.
David Stevenson. David Stevenson is Director of the Policy Planning and Strategy Division of the United Nations World Food Programme. These include policy guidance for the World Food Programme, new strategy plan, which sets out the objectives for food assistance in about 80 countries in a variety of interventions, including humanitarian relief and post-conflict situations, prevention and mitigation of disasters, nutrition, and HIV/AIDS. Major current challenges include dealing with record high food and fuel prices, climate change, and tight food commodity markets and post-food surplus era. Prior to this assignment, David served as a coordinator of Purchase for Progress, an initiative of the World Food Programme to use its purchasing power to contribute to agricultural production and market development. Dr. Stevenson has held posts in 7 countries through Africa, including responsibility for regional and local food purchases operations in Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and West Africa. From 2002 to 2007, he served as a World Food Programme representative and country director in Rwanda and in Zambia. In December 2007, he was appointed as a coordinator for Purchase for Progress based in Rome, Italy. Before joining the World Food Programme in 1992, he filled a number of positions with private sector and not-profit organizations in Canada. David has a political science degree from University of Calgary and a Master of Public Policy and Administration from Queen's University in Canada. Please help me welcoming Dr. Stevenson. One little thing, after colloquium, if you could stay for a couple of announcements, and just remember to have your cell phones and computers off. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. You called me Dr. Stevenson, which is a first for me. So you sort of like promoted me, which I know that it's a great honor here in such an epic institution of academic merit. But I'm Mr. David Stevenson with my MPA, but I wish you all very well in becoming doctors in your own right, and one day I will aspire to be so, if I am so lucky. And thank you also to Professor David Lewis and to Thomas O'Toole for inviting me here. It really is indeed a pleasure to come here to Cornell. I've heard about your university for many years, ever since I myself was a graduate student in Queens, not too far from here, up north across the lake. And so it's delightful to come and have a chance to meet you. I'm going to talk about the world food crisis, but I'm going to do more than that. I would like to take the chance of trying to root it in my own experiences in Africa working for the World Food Programme, and based on the education that I had as the Master of Public Administration student about 18, 19 years ago. And it really doesn't seem that long ago to me when I was a student like you all are here. Time goes very fast, let me tell you. One of the things I'm going to talk about throughout the afternoon is a key policy and administration challenge, and that is change and change management, or in our case, how to navigate change within a very big public international organization, the United Nations World Food Programme. And I want to focus on the World Food Programme strategic plan, something that we've been working on over the last year or so, and which is now being approved by our executive board, member states of the United Nations, and gives us the grounding and the green light to move forward in the next 3 or 4 years with our programming strategy. It also has given us the context to deal with the emerging food crisis over the last year. When I told some of my colleagues that I was coming to Cornell and that I was going to talk about strategic planning and change management, they really said, you know, Dave, don't do that. Because they said, my experience over 7 years in Africa is not about strategic planning and change management. So why would I come here and talk about that? How boring. Why don't I just tell you what I've been doing over the last 7 years and just talk directly about the food crisis? So I thought about that, and I thought, but you know, during my experience, I actually have very often been thinking back to my education and the kinds of things that I'm sure you've been learning and thinking about. And actually, there really has been a connection between what I've done over the years and now what I'm doing as the Director of Policy and Strategy at the World Food Program. So it's given me opportunity to put those pieces together, and I hope you'll see in the theme of my discussion that there really can be a connection with your education, with what you're learning about, and something very active like what I've been doing, traveling from one side of the continent of Africa to another in the most remote areas, trying to help people with food assistance. So I don't think it's boring, and I don't think change management is boring. I don't think strategic planning is boring, and I don't think the education you're getting here is boring. I think it's very exciting, and I'm sure you will find that in coming years as you get out into the working world. What I'm going to talk about is World Food Program as the largest humanitarian agency, who we are and how we've got to where we are and what our focus is in feeding people. I'm going to talk a little bit about our history in terms of change and strategic planning. I'm going to get a little bit teary-eyed when I reminisce about the people I have met over the years in my career and why that is relevant to the discussion of change management and what makes us tick in World Food Program. We will focus on the World Food crisis as a challenge that we've had to put our strategy into place over the last year. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Purchase for Progress, which is an innovative model that we're now launching in World Food Program with partners. And then I think we can wrap up, I hope, with your tradition of no doubt interesting comments and difficult questions. We at World Food Program were created in 1963, and largely thanks to your President Kennedy at the time. And I'm aware of this. I don't know if it's a ghost. One of your more famous graduates is here to coach me through this discussion. But I've been forewarned, and I don't know if you know who she is, but we'll do our best. So President Kennedy and George McGovern, in fact, came up with a model for which all United Nations member states bought into at the time. And essentially it was an idea to move food from surplus countries, so mountains of food in places like Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska, where I come from, in Western Canada, places of Europe, and to move it into countries that didn't have food deficits, or into the valleys of need. And that's how we started as a division within the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. We've subsequently become an independent UN agency. And we started more or less with the idea to respond to emergencies. Subsequently, we've become the largest humanitarian agency in the world. This year we'll feed about 90 million people in every continent. Right now, today, we're feeding 5 million people in Sudan, in Darfur, our biggest operation. So we're present almost everywhere where there is hunger, from Colombia to Sudan to Afghanistan to Laos or Nepal. And we manage a global lifeline. We answer the 911 call from governments in times of need, and we're able to mobilize food assistance in 24 to 48 hours. I've just come from Haiti yesterday, and I was looking at our operations in Haiti responding to Hurricane Ike, where we mobilized very quickly and are now helping to put a town of about 350,000 people back up on its feet. Tragic circumstances of Hurricane Ike and Gonaive, and we were able to react very quickly. Of course, we've done so with the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, with droughts and floods, with earthquakes, and that's really what gives us our mandate to move forward, is reacting to emergencies. We have a motto, which is that nothing gets between WFP and a hungry child. I had breakfast this morning with Professor Lewis, and he reminisced a bit about meeting an old colleague of mine in Mozambique during the civil conflict at the time, and how we were reacting very quickly. And I guess it was a discussion about our culture. Sometimes people call us cowboys. We simply just go out and get the job done, and that's the way we behave, or traditionally have behaved. And we're proud of that, frankly, because it helps us to get the job done where and when we need to. All of our funding is voluntary, so we don't get assessed contributions. We have to work for the resourcing that we need. And this year, our resource envelope will be about $5 billion, making it quite an enormous program, thanks to the generosity of member states and increasingly private individuals and foundations that are supporting us. Now, over the last 45 years, we've changed quite a lot. I mentioned we started to respond to emergency situations, but after only 2 years, we realized back in the 60s that to move food into the valleys of need takes a long time. It takes 6 to 8 months to gather food up, purchase it in countries like America, move it by ship, distribute it in Africa or in Asia. So we switched, and we started to do more long-term programming for development projects, school feeding projects, paying workers for food to do road construction and so on, nutrition programs. And we stayed that way through the 70s, until later in the 70s and through the 80s, we went back to an emergency humanitarian mandate, and we built a logistics network and a way of managing food donations in a much more dynamic way, doing loans and borrowings and being able to quickly respond with food aid to where it's needed. We also started purchasing food during those years. The situation was changing in the 80s and 90s as well, with the increasing need for us to respond to intrastate and interstate conflicts and natural disasters. So overall, a greater need, and the need for a global humanitarian institution like ours to respond with food assistance. We also started developing vulnerability assessment mechanisms, so we're able to go into the most remote areas and help governments and partners find out what are the problems that are causing hunger, how many people need assistance, and for how long. So generally just becoming a more effective organization. In the last 5 or 6 years, we started to developing much more our business practices, bringing in the private sector as partners, and just, again, increasing our efficiency. So change for WFP has been quite a constant. It's not a new thing, and we've learned lessons and increasingly reacted to the world we're living in. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the world we're living in now and why World Food Program is now in a very much of a change management process. I think you probably all study the effects of the economy, a very current issue. We're very concerned about economic stability on Wall Street and globally, as it will affect the way we work, affect the resources we get, and the global spin-offs of instability are a great concern. Issues of security, particularly political stability, post 9/11 world, issues of polarization are a concern. Environmental issues are very much a concern. Issues of climate change, which are increasing the rapidity or the number of disasters globally that we respond to. But what we have needed to do is just develop enough of an understanding to be able to look ahead in the world and develop a plan to adapt to it. And so I will talk a little bit about that process, the planning process. And again, the main tool we use is a strategic plan, which we've developed over the last year and is looking forward to the next 3 or 4 years. It's been approved by our executive board. It's quite a comprehensive document, but it's only 20 pages long, which is our intention to keep it short, to keep it readable so that it's used, so it's an active document. It builds on our strengths and helps us look ahead where we're going. The first thing our strategic plan does is tell us who we are. So what we did was we took stock of what's going out in the most remotest corners of the world, and we tried to put that in writing, which was a new thing because previous strategic plans, frankly, when they were read by people in the field, didn't really look like we were talking about them. We were talking about international policy issues, talking about things of interest to our executive board, but were we really talking about issues of our field staff and how they relate? So we very much tried to affirm who we are in our strategic plan. And we've also looked at putting together in a very succinct form a strategy for adapting to the changing world. There are 5 objectives in our strategic plan. The first one is reacting to acute emergencies. So the storms in Haiti, the civil conflicts, droughts, floods, the tsunamis. This is the main part of our work. But we've also added to that a strategic objective to help prevent disasters. So the bookmark ahead of the acute emergencies. And then another bookmark to help rebuild, to help countries recover and find hunger solutions. And then our 4th objective is about nutrition and better nutritious products. And our 5th is dealing with handover strategies, helping governments to take over the role of dealing with the hungry poor in their countries. And that's where Purchase for Progress comes in as well, which I'll talk about. It's a living instrument which has required the support and buy-in of many in the process, and most importantly, our own staff. So that's got us into some tactical management, having some leadership strategies which are really about tactics to get people from all over the world, a multicultural, multinational workforce that we have, to buy into this and to participate in it. Now, change management is a bit of a buzzword, I know. That's why they made fun of me in Rome when I said I was going to talk about it here. But really, it's no joke. It's really an important policy and administration mechanism to put into place, because you're dealing with the peculiarities of staff, their personalities, their backgrounds, and they feel very strongly about what they've developed in their work. And frankly, they don't easily change. So there needs to be a way to deal with that. I want to explain that within WFP, and now I'm just going to talk a little bit about our culture. Because our culture is built around the fact that we move food. As I said, that almost cowboy logistics culture that we're very proud of and very good at, moving food to people who need it and when they need it. But we've needed to have a fundamental shift because the world has changed. So we've needed to put into new tools into place other than just food transfers that deal with the root causes of hunger, that deal with the new effects of climate change, of rising food prices, and so on. There is no more mountain of food for us to draw on. So change is essential. But the dilemma we had was coming up with a change process that still recognizes our core value and that people see themselves in. So we needed to understand what makes us tick in World Food Program. And that's not the academic exercise. It's more of an emotional exercise. It's a point of feeling. I was in a policy think tank discussion some weeks ago, and somebody asked, all of the policy analysts in the room, what keeps you awake at night? What are the big issues that keeps you awake at night? And of course, these very thoughtful participants talked about the economy and security, and she's still here.
Yeah. Shall I turn off the computer?
Yeah, try that.
Do you need it?
Yeah, just shut it off. Good idea.
Yeah.
I'll speak up. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So I'll start over from the start. In the World Food Program, I have to admit to you, we don't spend time thinking about big issues of the economy, security, politics, even big issues of the environment. So what is it that keeps us awake at night? What makes us tick in the World Food Program? And I mentioned I went to a policy think tank, and this is the question that they asked us, and it's more of a feeling or an opinion that I have, but I think it's a true feeling or opinion of humanitarians. Because at WFP, with our culture, we almost get frustrated by the sort of heady dialogue in New York or in capitals or even potentially in academic institutions, the theory. We recognize it's very important, but often we don't see that it's reflecting our daily lives out in the most remote corners of the world. We're actually more doers. We're not really thinkers. We're about people, not policy. So what keeps us awake at night is our driving ambition to help the hungry poor. Now, why is this? What am I talking about? Well, again, it's an emotional feeling. And it's a feeling that you develop when you spend years and years traveling around, and even in the most remote, decrepit circumstances, when you meet people, they look at you in the eye, they smile, they will offer you hospitality if they have any hospitality to offer you. And you appreciate that. You develop this human bond, this feeling you have. If you get in trouble, say you have a flat tire, who knows where, Afghanistan, in Zambia, Nepal. What happens if you have a flat tire? The first passerby stops and helps you out. That's what happens. And you say, thank you very much for helping out, and you go on. So what keeps us awake at night is that feeling. It's that feeling that when there is a disaster, when there's a challenge, we step up to the plate, our hearts start beating, we're driven by adrenaline, we want to help. That's our culture. I think that's the root of a humanitarian agency. That's what keeps us awake at night. So what has been important is to capture that within a strategic planning, change management process. Now, back to academia, just a few more ideas on the change management process in WFP. The first is that we needed good leadership, and we have good leadership. A visionary leader who came from the outside and looked at WFP from a new angle, saw that the mountain of food was gone, and is encouraged to do us to do something different and helped to show us the way. The second step has been collaboration, getting different actors to participate all over the organization, the executive board, wherever they are. And it's been a year-long process. Just next week we're having a global meeting, and we're going to be inviting country directors from 80 countries. We're going to be reviewing our strategy and talking through lessons learned and making revisions as we go along. Another very big lesson or step, of course, is communication. It's just really important to keep communicating. And lastly is flexibility. The plan needed to have built-in flexibility because the change is occurring every day. And as it happened within our planning process, trying to build on our strength and setting out a vision for the future, we were confronted with the global food crisis. We knew it was coming. We knew it was coming about a year ago. We had no idea it was coming as fast as it came. It crept up on us much quicker, prices tripling, doubling within months. And that resulted in literally presidents calling up my boss, Josette Sheeran, our executive director, saying, look, please help. We've got problems we never understood. These are creating political issues for us, and there are hungry people. Please help. There's a number of factors for the world food crisis. On the one hand, of course, increasing demand, particularly in emerging economies, now since emerged, in fact, China and India, for example, people eating more meat. It takes about 8 times more cereal for a kilo of beef than for just consuming the cereal. So it's quite a radical shift in demand for food. Biofuel production is certainly an issue, and the demand for biofuel, low dollar exchange rates, some institutional investment on commodity markets, speculation, pension funds, and so on. And on the other hand, supply hasn't really kept pace. Again, we're in a post-food surplus world. The global buffer stock is not there as it used to be. We have high energy prices. There are some export restrictions. Overall low productivity growth in developing countries, still struggling to pick up their yields, is a problem. Now, although the causes vary, some are subject of debate, the impact of the crisis is actually not being debated. We've been receiving quite a lot of support for our appeals when we've been explaining the impact of the food crisis, which has been quite encouraging. I think I mentioned that there's about 130 million people added to the list of the food insecure, of the hungry poor, due to rising food prices. That we're only feeding 90 million globally out of 840 million who already existed means it's a great challenge. That's a new statistic coming out of FAO and the World Bank. So, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in fact, looking at about 130 million people overall affected in developing countries due to the food price crisis. And what's happening is that families are eliminating their meals, or they're eating less nutritious food, sacrificing their livelihoods. And this varies on the income. So for example, if for those living on less than $2 a day, they might cut out health care or education expenditures. For those living on $1 a day, they will cut out protein and reduce the nutrition in their diet. For those living on $1 a day or 50 cents or less a day, they'll cut out meals altogether, with the obvious effects on nutrition and malnutrition increasing, stunting mental and physical health. Some communities, particularly Haiti, Senegal, and Thailand, have expressed their anger through riots and violence, urban disturbances due to the food crisis. And these are certainly very serious concerns. In fact, historically, societies, great cultures, have risen or fallen partly due to the availability of food. There's a very good book out I'm reading now called Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond, that sets that out a bit, which I'm finding with quite a lot of interest. But just to hint at a real-life policy analysis process that I'm now involved in, and I mentioned I was just in Haiti, I'm a little bit disturbed that there's a message out there that rising food prices is leading to anger and riots, and that then becomes the need for a policy focus. There does need to be a policy recognition of this, but what I'm disturbed about is the message that hungry people are angry people, because the truth is they're not. When you go anywhere in the world, when you meet hungry people, they're not angry. They might be tired, but they're very resilient, and they're smiling. That's who we meet every day. So we just have to be careful with that messaging, and we have to make sure that our policy focus is on meeting the needs of the hungry poor, not catering to the angry. I was going to show you a short video, but some lady came and told me not to do it. So I'm going to skip through that as a technical difficulty coming from Rome. But the video was going to show you basically in their own words, people from all over the world speaking about the effects of the food crisis. So that means people in the urban ghettos and slums in Haiti talking about the food crisis, people in Senegal, widow in Zambia trying to deal with it, some people affected by HIV/AIDS that are having a difficult time meeting their food needs because of the rising food crisis and therefore dropping out of the drug regimen that they need for a healthy life. And there was a very dynamic teacher in Nepal telling her story about the rising food prices. So it certainly has an impact on the people that we serve. But it's also got an impact on WFP because our costs have doubled or tripled. The costs to WFP to feed hungry people in the world. Therefore, it's quite an important fundraising task we have to get in resources to meet the needs of people with rising costs. Now the question has become, once we have our strategic plan, change management process underway, how do we address the food crisis? And I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with our partners on the food crisis. One priority was to collaborate within a global collaborative mechanism. So the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, put together a high-level task force, partly with our advocacy and encouragement. I think everybody wanted this to happen within the UN system and partners. We've been working in that task force with FAO, with the World Bank and others to put together a comprehensive framework for action globally. And that's looking at immediate steps to meet the food and nutrition needs of people, as well as looking at longer-term steps to develop food and nutrition security systems that can dampen the shock of the food crisis. Again, when we put together our strategic plan, we didn't directly address the food crisis, which was emerging, but we did make sure it was flexible, and it's allowed us the ability to react to the food crisis without having to go to our board or somebody for a new agreement to react in a different way. So it's been flexible enough to work fast. And therefore, we've put in a number of rapid interventions in urban areas and rural areas in about 20 countries. All over the world. I won't name the 20 countries, but there's been 20 priority countries for us to work on, primarily because the risk of high prices affecting their population is greater. And that means the prices are higher, but it also means that the general vulnerability in the country was greater. So those things combined, and we've been prioritizing a number of countries. With our strategic plan, we're not only doing food transfers anymore, and that's the big shift. We're providing food to those who need it, but we're also providing cash for those when there is a market nearby that can respond. We're providing vouchers, which are redeemable very often for nutritious products and so on. And we're very much concerned with increasing the quality of nutrition. So making sure that people not only get food, but they get high quality food so they can improve their nutrition status. And we're looking at local production and helping local capacity to meet food needs. Now for someone that's been in the business of food aid, the fact that WFP is not just doing food transfers is actually a huge shift. It's quite innovative. It builds on our core strengths, but it's certainly been quite a challenge to get people to think different and to program their work in countries in a different way. It reflects the structural change that our world is in, but it hasn't been easy. I'd like to focus on just one example of the shift in practical terms, and that's purchase for progress. We've been buying food over a number of years in emerging markets in the same countries where we distribute. I started doing that personally back in 1994 in Uganda, where we bought food for the for the crisis in Rwanda, the neighboring country where there was the war and genocide. So we got contributions from a number of countries. We started buying food. But the system that we set up to buy food was simply a competitive system. We did open tenders for traders. We chose the best price. And the objective was to get food to people who needed it as quickly and as cost effectively as possible. Last year we purchased about $612 million of food in developing countries, $54 million just in Uganda. So it's an enormous progress for Uganda, partly spurred on by the incentive from our purchasing since '94. President Museveni, by the way, was discussing with us at the sidelines of the General Assembly last week that he sees the food crisis as an opportunity for his farmers. And it's true. Every crisis is an opportunity if it's well managed. And certainly small-scale farmers are starting to benefit because they're getting a better return for their produce. But in the past year, we've started to ask ourselves, is there any way we can purchase food, but in a more systematic, in a more planned way, so that we're not only just getting food for our other program priorities, for refugees, for displaced people, for school children, but by buying food, we're making an impact. So I know some of you are working in project design and so on in your studies. We designed a project with objectives to contribute to market development, to agricultural production, with partners, and with activities, different models of procurement rather than just tendering that we will pilot and see if we can really make an impact through a monitoring system. In our research, you see, and from our own experience, we find when people talk about agricultural development or even market development, they're missing a piece very often. Agricultural development is usually looking at supply-side interventions, seeds and tools, extension workers, training, fertilizer support, all extremely important to step up. And on the market side, we look at infrastructure needs, roads, warehouse facilities, cleaning facilities, and so on. But there's another piece that is assumed perhaps, but actually the assumption doesn't hold true in many remote areas of emerging markets. And that piece is, even if you do very well on the production side, you increase yields, you put in the market infrastructure, someone's got to buy the food. Someone needs to go in there and put money into the pockets of small-scale farmers or low-income farmers so they have an incentive to produce more. Some countries do that. In China, they've done it recently. They've subsidized purchases in remote areas, and now they're starting to phase down that program because the agricultural economy is working enough for the commercial sector to take that role. But in many countries where we work, that's a market failure. So with Purchase for Progress, we're coming along with supply-side partners to say, let's work together. You all work on the supply side. We'll support you. And we're going to be there to buy. And we can give forward guaranteed contracts so that farmers or farmers associations can go to the bank and get credit so they can invest in their land, fertilizer, and so on. So they know that if they make those investments, someone's going to buy their produce. This is an innovative program also responding to the rising food prices. Because if we simply buy without due attention to these issues of supply, we can contribute to increasing prices. And we've been very worried about that. Now, if we buy, though, with a package that is overall about increasing production and markets, we're contributing to the solution. So it's a whole shift of mindset that we're involved in terms of pitching WFP to the world, but also training our staff to think about hunger solutions, getting to the root cause of hunger in every way we can. I would also point out that Purchase for Progress is not charity. It's about farmers working hard, from sunrise. That's what they do. And what we're doing is coming along to buy their produce. But we're not really doing them a favor. They're doing us a favor. they're the ones that are working hard, producing, and we're coming along to buy their produce at a fair price and move it to needy people. Again, shifting mindset, a win-win situation, helping production and market development, and also getting food for needy people when they need it. So, our strategic plan is really a shift for us, and I wanted to share it with you because the message is that that policy analysis process, the planning process, the change management process is very important, and it can really help with substantive change anywhere in the world, including the really remote places where we work, from Darfur to North Korea to Colombia. We are a very big bureaucracy, but we try to behave small and flexibly. And with the food crisis, it's a structural shift in the way we're working. And I think we're only just beginning to understand that. So we really need good thinkers like you all to be continuing to research, to be continuing to advise us, and to help us understand the root causes and the effects of rising food prices, the structural changes on global commodity markets. And we will help on the practical side, ensuring that there are practical ways in remote communities to address the food crisis in an appropriate way. Plans are only as good as the people who are implementing them. And as future leaders, I hope that you don't forget engagement of development and development of those people who are implementing is at the core of your work. Without that, organizations will go nowhere. Effective policy thinkers and doers must have the ability to think and act critically and analytically, but also to understand the interdependence of the world, to appreciate the relationship between history, the economy, politics, and culture, to appreciate culture and religious diversity, the willingness to see the world in shades of gray, not just black and white, and the skills and values to give the underpinnings to be able to create collaborative, flexible, and effective communication plans, taking your organizations or your careers to the next level. I think it's an exciting time to be involved in global policy analysis. It's certainly an exciting time for us in World Food Program to be working on policy analysis and public administration. And I think if we dream a little bit, if we are real optimists in the work we do, we can agree together that we're trying, and hopefully we are somehow making a difference in the world, a positive difference in the world. So thanks. It's been a pleasure to be here. So you all have questions and comments and advice? Great.
We have time for a few questions. We can start from there.
Hello, my name is Chandana, and well, I found what you said very interesting, but I also kept getting the idea that behind all this structural change, the change management you're talking about, I just feel I don't think you're very comfortable with it. Or is that just maybe just something that I took off? Secondly, can you actually believe, or do we have some sort of a measured time, and are we able to? Because we're all responsible. You are just an organization, and as you said, you have contributing members or countries. Be able to eradicate food crises all over the world. And is it really helping this change that you have brought about?
Okay, thanks. It's good that if it came across that change is an uncomfortable process. And we're in a very uncomfortable point in the World Food Program. It's almost like we're in the middle of a revolution, but we don't know it. Shifting from food transfers to other ways of looking at hunger solutions. And there is pressure from all areas in us getting it right. So it's uncomfortable, or it's a challenging time. And again, I think that's what makes me fall back on the planning process and the change management process. Now, in terms of whether we can eradicate hunger, there's a few issues at play here. One is in terms of agricultural production. Agricultural production needs to double, we think, between now and 2050 to meet the food needs globally. And how's it going to do that? And I think one way that is obvious is that in the countries where we work, in Africa and Asia and parts of Latin America, where yields are so very low, it's particularly among small-scale farmers, 1 metric ton per hectare, for example, as opposed to 13, 14, 15 metric tons a hectare in the United States and other countries. If you can just double the yields from 1 ton a hectare to 2 tons a hectare or 3 tons a hectare, that's where you're going to get your biggest bang for global production. And the good news is the world has recognized that and putting a lot more emphasis into agricultural production because of the food crisis. And that's an opportunity to focus on it. And we see that very much in Africa, people rallying behind this need for agricultural growth. But the food crisis and the need for WFP, it's more than just production. It's about access to food. So even if there is productive gains, you know, how is the world going to make sure that the poorest of the poor have access to food? And that's an issue here in the United States. It's an issue everywhere. And that's where I think eradicating problems of access to food are more challenging. I think you're going to need more long-term social protection safety net systems for those who can't produce their food or cannot participate in an economy to be able to buy their food. And that means economic development in countries that can't do that so that they can start doing it their own way. Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you for your comments. From Nigeria, and our experience back in Nigeria is that 30 to 50% of what gets harvested, by the time you get to the market, 30 to 50% gets to rot. In your agenda, do you have a strategy towards preservation of food items? Because that will also go a long way in increasing what you have on the ground as opposed to increase in production. Thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks. That's another example that we feel we need this strategy to partner up with people doing supply side work and market development and dealing with, in this case, quality control, rather than just buying on an ad hoc way. So very much part of our strategy is whether World Food Program ourselves gets into the business of, you know, improving warehouses and training on quality control or not would depend on the country and whether we're already present and whether we have a comparative advantage, because there are many other actors who exist for that kind of a reason. What we will certainly be doing, though, is partnering up. I will give you an example. Jeffrey Sachs' Millennium Villages, which are making some inroads, and that's, you know, a model of intensive investment in districts from agriculture to education to health and so on. There's a village in western Uganda, and they managed to produce a surplus of 500 tons of maize. 340 tons went to waste, as you said. So what is that, 60%? It rotted because there was no market, wasn't adequately stored, it was infested and so on. Well, now we're partnering up with this village where we can purchase some of that surplus and then help them with longer term solutions, accessing markets, commercial markets in Uganda. And we're providing some training on quality control as well with partners, and they're improving their warehouse with some of the revenues they're getting and so on. So yeah, it's a good example of this kind of partnership that's needed.
Thank you. I think your talk was very enlightening. And I want to know, you were talking about the fact that buying from the local farmers in one country, you try to control for price. I just want to know, can you explain more? As in, how big bodies coming to buy from the local farmers, they are more willing to sell to you than to sell in their local farmers, which would then cause food insecurity for the local people in the country you're buying from. So I just want to check, are the mechanisms you have in place, are they empirical, or you just try to be sure that you're not, as in, do you actually measure it and evaluate periodically?
Yeah, another very, very important question, the pricing dynamic. Through our usual system of buying food, the price is based on the tender. We do a competitive tender, people bid, the lowest price we select. And as long as that isn't over the import parity price, which is a sign of a distorted market, that's the price mechanism. But when we go into forward contracting, there needs to be another price mechanism. And that's one of the challenging things we're working on now. Now the good news is, over the years in most countries, there is quite vibrant market analysis being done at the village level. It's a U.S. NGO, FuseNet, for example, that's working in many countries on pricing data. So we'll be looking at that and other mechanisms. At the same time, we're going to keep tenders rolling and pegging our pricing, in most cases, to the more or less tender price that results through the simultaneous tender system. Many countries have marketing boards as well. Warehouse receipt programs are coming up in some countries, which is another way of putting buyers and sellers together that we'll be contributing in as we go forward. But you've hit on one of the most biggest challenges of my shop right now today, is to figure out how we're going to have pricing on long-term contracts, particularly in volatile markets. We don't mind paying a little bit more, it's okay. We'd rather not. We don't mind if it has a benefit that's monitored and that's proven to have a benefit. But paying more can also distort markets. And, we start running the private sector out of business, which is not at all what we have in mind. We're going to be working with the private sector. They are very important in these economies.
Sarah.
I find this program really, really interesting, and one of the thoughts that was going through my head was, if you're going into forward contracting, what kind of mechanisms tell your long-term customer you have a little bit more leeway in terms of influencing things like labor standards and environmental standards. So I was wondering if you have any of those kinds of standards that are built into these contracts. If not, if this sort of goes away from the cowboy mentality, let's just go in there and get it done. If you're working with groups like UNDP or other organizations to try and get some of those standards set up.
Yeah, another topical question. I just had a meeting last week in New York with UNDP, and they are working on, you may know, they're working on some rights issues right now. And so we talked about getting in touch with some of our country offices and partnering up on that. We in the World Food Program would probably not have a direct role in advocating for land rights and so on. But what we do have is the ability from our practical experience to, let's say, testify or share our experiences and say, listen, there's a lot going on in this country and we're buying food in this country, but one of the problems you're having is land ownership, and particularly affecting women in many cases as not having title to land. And we're going to be very much interested in sharing those experiences and advocating. But the point is, we're not going to be developing the capacity to work on contractual law issues and so on. There are other agencies like UNDP that are created for that. Yeah.
Thank you for coming to speak. I'm in the government department, and I know you mentioned that you're not really looking at the macro structural causes of the crisis, but I just wanted to know if you could touch on this, because some people are saying that we're not at a food deficit, that there still is enough food, but that U.S. subsidies and food aids sort of create a structural dependency on aid and these aid programs. So do you think that this is true? And what is your comment on the system?
First of all, I didn't mean to say that we're not looking at macro issues. We are, at least there's a small group of us who are, but of our, say, 9,000 staff members, most of them are out in the field offices. They're simply too busy and too preoccupied to be dealing with those issues. Now we're in the process of reshaping that culture, which was my message on that issue. In terms of structural issues, about 60% of our food now is purchased globally on markets, which means between 40 and 50% is donated in kind, and most of that is coming from the United States. We're discussing with the U.S. Options for them being more flexible as a donor in terms of cash and in-kind contributions, so that we as WFP have the ability to make decisions as to whether we're going to purchase or accept an in-kind donation, and whether that donation or purchase would be in the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, or anywhere else. In-kind food distributions are still going to be necessary. We have no doubt about that. So even in a completely, let's say, liberalized food assistance market where agencies like ours receive 100% cash contributions, we're still going to be buying on the international market for needs, and we're still going to be buying in countries like the United States. That would be what our projection would say. But what we're asking for is a little bit more flexibility. Yeah. You know, the percentage of food aid going into global commodity trading system, if you look at the overall commercial trade globally, is really a fraction. So I think that can be exaggerated sometimes in terms of the distorting effect that it may or may not have, and that is less our concern, frankly. More of our concern and focus is just to have the flexibility.
Mario, then Jack.
I was wondering if, for one of my classes, finance, nonprofit, and management, we're looking at a case study on the Red Cross, and so we're reading about their board of supervisors and how they had issues. I was wondering what kind of structure, if there is one, I don't know if it's the states that actually serve as a governing or guiding body, or are there boards of directors for your organization? And if so, can you just tell us a little bit about that and how it helps, or how it has helped, or how it has hindered your efforts?
Yeah, with pleasure. We have an executive board which is member states, rotating member states, about 40 rotating. Some countries are almost always on the board, the key donors, and that's a voluntary agreement that the executive board makes amongst themselves. And we go to the board 3 times a year, certainly with policy and with some strategic analysis, and also with projects that need to be approved, projects that are designed in various countries, so that they approve the resource allocation. So yeah, it's quite a dynamic board, in fact. It's become increasingly more involved in our work. And that's one of my biggest jobs, is to help prepare policy and strategic analysis that then goes to the board for consideration or approval. So they provide that dual role, sort of consultation and advice, and to some extent oversight, whilst also many of them are donors. And we are voluntary funded, so that it creates an interesting dynamic as well, when your executive board is also your donor community in a voluntary funded organization.
It's kind of difficult that there's so many, since you said there's 40 rotating. Is that
There's a bureau which is, there are 5 groups, and they have, let's say, team leaders, and there's a president and a vice president. So that makes it a little more efficient in terms of working with that smaller group as needed on the agenda and on other issues. But the board meetings are, you know, compared to the private sector, let's say, they're a little more intense, they're longer. It takes 3 or 4 days usually for our board to meet 3 times a year. partly because of its size. Yeah.
Jack, yeah.
I'm Jack Well. I'm a first-year CEPA student from Dallas, Texas, and I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on the impact that biofuel production is having on the availability of food, and what you think, what it's going to be like in the future.
Yeah, good. You're probably aware, Jack, that there's a whole set of research going on right now about that very question. And we've seen reports from anywhere of 4% in terms of the contribution of biofuel to the price issue that the world is facing. So about a 4% contribution measured against other factors that we talked about. There are some reports up to 55, 60%. And the average is around 20%. And we continue to seek advice for that. Now, I would say in the developing countries where we work, the ability of alternative crops, particularly in marginal lands, so crops like jatropha and so on, can be actually probably useful to agricultural economies, and also for biofuel production. There is a problem when it's directly competing with the food needs of people, particularly in countries that really have aggregate deficits and are having difficulty feeding their people, and also with this very tight market that we're facing this year internationally. So we would obviously prefer that policy towards biofuel looks at crops which are not directly in competition with feeding people.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is, okay, how has the liberalization of import markets affected food security? Then the second question is, how does WFP make sure that the food that you give out gets to the people who need it? Okay, I'm asking this because I know of cases whereby, okay, the food has gone to the countries, then it ends up, the people who are on the top tier end up maybe getting the food and saving it, then the people who really need the food don't end up not getting it. So how do you make sure that the ones in the villages really get the food?
The first question was about
how has liberalization of import markets affected food security issues? Liberalization.
the liberalization of import markets. Okay. I mean, liberalizing an import market makes food from the outside cheaper, right? So for the consumer, it's probably a good thing. For the producer, though, in the same country, it can be a bad thing because it competes with their production. We have an issue right now in Haiti, where I just came from, where they import about 2/3 of their rice requirements, and their local rice production is about 30% more expensive, 40% more expensive even, than the imported rice. And it's a liberalized market. Now, the question can be asked, how should Haiti be dealing with that? Should they keep the market open, or should they be looking at programs to protect or encourage their own rice production? I would probably keep the market open, but I think that's an important policy question to deal with. On the issue of how food is distributed, I think mechanisms have been developed over the years where food, by and large, does get to the people who need it. These kinds of distribution systems have now been going on 30, 40 years in some cases, and there is a lot of expertise and collaboration in that area. But we're very excited by being able to now come up with alternatives, the cash transfers, the voucher programs, looking at new nutritious products and so on, because the food transfer is a limited instrument, and sometimes it does not get to where it's really needed, sometimes because it's not the correct response. Maybe there already is food on the market, or people have a way of getting their basic food needs, and we shouldn't be therefore dealing with the problem with food. This can happen in refugee camps, for example, where we tend to give full ration, but refugees might have access to food in other ways, so they sell much of their food to get clothing, to get soap, and so on. So maybe we should be looking at other ways so that they can get their soap and clothing and other things other than a food distribution system, which is then spun off for other needs. So most importantly, it's a targeting question, but the fact that our response option is more diverse now should also help.
We have time for one more question, one quick question. There.
I actually want to ask about the systems of distribution. Do the systems of distribution differ according to countries or according to the groups that get it? For example, pregnant mothers get food, I don't know, through some kind of one system of distribution, and or refugees get through second system of distribution, and or maybe the systems of distribution vary according to the country. For example, African countries get through, I don't know, some kind of other systems of help. And the second question was that this economist Jeffrey Sachs also mentioned that countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't actually have only one problem. They have a whole range of problems. For example, a family may face a problem of disease, and if family is deceased, then actually they can't work. If they can't work, for example, they don't have job. If they don't have job, of course they don't have money, and consequently they cannot find food or money to get this food. So that do you collaborate with other programs in order, for example, to eliminate food problems, poverty problems, or some kind of, I don't know, disease problems also?
Okay, thanks. Good questions. The systems of food distribution traditionally for WFP have not been much different, irregardless of the region of the world or the country in the world. When we've been doing food transfers, distributing food at the request of governments to meet the needs of vulnerable people, we go out, we do a vulnerability assessment, we determine what is the problem we're facing, to what extent is it a food problem, and then we design a distribution system of food, be it at schools, be it at nutrition centers, be it at refugee camps, and so on. Now with our new strategic plan, we'll be much more context specific. And we've piloted these activities in various ways. For example, with the tsunami wiped out the coastal areas in many countries in Asia and off the Indian Ocean. But very often markets or the productive zones were left intact. So that's an area where cash transfers were really an obvious choice, and we piloted them in a number of countries, giving people cash so they could buy their food. I mentioned voucher programs and processing options and so on that we're looking at. School feeding as well is being redesigned because there can be a different model of school feeding depending on the problem you're trying to solve. We're putting together what we're calling homegrown school feeding now, where we're linking it to our purchase program, trying to buy food locally or have school gardens and other programs for the children. And that works in some countries, but it doesn't work in other countries where you have this acute food insecurity, rising food prices, and where you actually don't want to go into the market for a school feeding program because it may have an adverse effect. So now we're going to be much more diverse with our set of tools to address problems across the world. But traditionally our system of distribution has been, I would say, quite standard. It changes due to the context, but not due to the geographical region or the country. Yeah, Jeffrey Sachs and many problems. And yes, he's able to simplify for us a whole diverse range of problems with some policy actions and advice to be tackled. And again, I can't overemphasize the need for partnerships in all of this. And World Food Program is going to be much more dynamic in terms of seeking out partnerships and using our purchase power, as well as seeking advice for dealing with the food needs of people in our emergency response and so on. But we cannot solve all the world's problems. We need to work with others, and the whole range of problems in terms of poverty reduction need to be dealt with. And I would say at the top of the list, well, two things at the top of the list: good management and leadership and governance, and then the comprehensive resource packages as Jeffrey Sachs sets out, so that there can really be overall national plans that are well funded and drive growth forward, for which we would be a small part, but an important part.